In 1812, Illinois was still a territory, a patchwork of settlements surrounded by wilderness, where communities were small and isolated. In such a place, word traveled slowly, and reputations were everything. Against this backdrop, the Blackstone family arrived, presenting themselves as pious, educated, and driven by a mission, to bring structure, learning, and Christian values to the scattered youth of the region. They were led by Patriarch Elias Blackstone, a stern man of formidable presence who spoke with the cadence of a preacher and the intensity of a prophet. His wife, Temperance, equally devout, played the role of nurturing matron, tending to both the emotional and physical needs of the children under their care. Their 4 children, ranging from teenagers to early adulthood, were all said to be trained in various scholarly and practical disciplines, reading, Latin, mathematics, and agriculture. They settled just outside of what would eventually become part of Pike County, Illinois, erecting a large, brick-walled building they called Blackstone Academy. Unlike the typical log cabin schoolhouses of the era, this building was more imposing, with iron-grilled windows and a heavy oak door that remained bolted at night. Its very structure hinted at both ambition and secrecy. Elias claimed it was to protect the children from godless men and wild beasts. But behind closed doors, the reasons were far darker. From the beginning, the Blackstones positioned themselves as moral stewards of the region. They were active in religious gatherings and took in children not only from nearby towns but also orphans and troubled youths from farther afield. Flyers were posted as far as St. Louis and Cincinnati, advertising the academy as a place where the disobedient may be reformed, the dull-minded sharpened, and the immoral returned to grace. Wealthy families seeking discipline for their wayward sons, or a proper education for their daughters, eagerly paid fees and signed away custody for months at a time. The Blackstones cultivated trust with the community, often hosting church services and giving food to the poor. No one questioned the harsh discipline that Elias preached. After all, in those days, a strong hand was often seen as a necessary corrective. Visitors to the academy often remarked on the eerie silence of the halls and the sternness of the children. They looked like they were afraid to breathe, one traveler later recalled. But discipline was the advertised product. The quieter the children, the more effective the methods must have seemed. It was only later that former students, those who managed to escape or were dismissed, spoke of the true nature of the academy. They described cold, windowless rooms where they were locked for days, forced fasting, beatings under the guise of purification, and being made to witness grotesque punishments carried out in the name of salvation. Despite these stories, many in the surrounding areas turned a blind eye. The Blackstones were generous with their resources, and in a time where law enforcement was scarce and fragmented, no one wanted to stir trouble with a family that appeared so upright and God-fearing. Even when children went missing, always explained away as runaways or reclaimed by family, no significant inquiry was made. Elias kept meticulous records, though many were later found to be forgeries, with names, payment receipts, and fabricated letters of withdrawal from parents who were long dead or unreachable. The illusion of legitimacy was carefully maintained. What made the deception so effective was how the Blackstones performed the role society expected. Elias preached virtue and punishment in equal measure. Temperance played the role of the suffering but faithful wife, often nursing children with fevers that never reached any town doctor. Their children were seen tending the gardens, carrying books, and reciting scripture at public gatherings. They appeared to be the ideal Christian family, sacrificing their time and resources to help the less fortunate. No one suspected they were using this same cover to isolate, manipulate, and brutalize the most vulnerable. The most chilling part of their public persona was how it mirrored so many legitimate institutions of the time. Harsh discipline, religious indoctrination, isolation from family, these were common features of 19th-century reform schools and academies. The Blackstones took what was already normalized and pushed it to an extreme, hiding unspeakable abuse beneath layers of respectability and routine. They were not merely cruel, they were calculating. They knew what people wanted to see, and they gave it to them, while ensuring the truth remained locked behind their heavy doors. As the years passed at Blackstone Academy, whispers began to circulate in nearby settlements. Stories of children who never returned, letters from parents that went unanswered, and travelers who vanished without a trace. These accounts were often dismissed as hearsay or blamed on the dangers of frontier life, wild animals, bandits, or the natural perils of a largely untamed landscape. But for those who lived near the academy, a pattern began to emerge, subtle but persistent. Something was happening near the Blackstone property, and it was not simply bad luck or coincidence. The first known case that drew real suspicion involved a 13-year-old boy named Caleb Denton. Sent by his family from Vincennes, Indiana Territory, he had been described as high-spirited and unruly. His parents hoped the strict religious environment of the academy would temper his behavior. After a few months, they stopped receiving letters from him. When they reached out, Elias responded with a curt note claiming Caleb had run away during the night after being disciplined for blasphemy and theft. No further information was offered, and the family, lacking both money and influence, could do little more than grieve. The boy was never seen again. This was not an isolated case. Over the following 3 years, at least a dozen children disappeared under similar circumstances. Some were said to have run off. Others were reportedly reclaimed by distant relatives, though no one in the area ever met these so-called relatives. In more than one instance, children were simply erased from the academy's records entirely. When concerned families or local residents asked questions, they were met with calm reassurances, religious platitudes, and a veneer of righteous indignation. Elias claimed that his work was under attack by agents of sin, trying to undermine the Lord's mission. Most backed down in the face of his authority and composure. Strangers, too, began to vanish in the vicinity. Peddlers, itinerant preachers, and farmhands traveling between counties would occasionally pass through the region and never reach their next destination. Their disappearances were difficult to trace, given the poor state of communication and law enforcement. The roads were few, and the wilderness was thick. Many assumed these people fell victim to robbery, wild animals, or simply lost their way in an unforgiving environment. But when their last known stops often coincided with the area surrounding Blackstone Academy, suspicion mounted quietly among those paying attention. One particularly disturbing account came from a young farmhand named Robert Kelson. He had been hired by the Blackstones to do a week's work chopping firewood and tending to livestock. According to his later statements, he left before the week was up, disturbed by what he saw. He spoke of hearing screams late at night, of rooms that were bolted shut from the outside, and of a strange, sickly odor that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. When he asked questions, Temperance told him it was the sound of souls being cleansed. Elias dismissed his curiosity with cold stares and veiled threats. Robert left in the dead of night, refusing payment, and never returned. More evidence of disappearances came in the form of missing persons posters that began to accumulate across taverns and church notice boards. Children, mostly, but also young women and men looking for work or education. Several had reportedly made inquiries about the academy or had been seen in the company of one of the Blackstone children. These connections were tenuous but troubling. In one case, a young woman named Esther Langston was last seen boarding a wagon with Nathaniel Blackstone, the eldest son. Her family received a letter, supposedly from Esther, stating she had decided to marry and move to Ohio. But the handwriting did not match, and her body was never found. Even local indigenous communities, who largely avoided the academy and its grounds, spoke of unease. Hunters reported hearing unnatural sounds at night, and some believed the land itself had become cursed. Tribal elders warned their young not to go near the property, describing it as a place of bad spirits and stolen breath. Though their warnings were dismissed by settlers, their instincts were grounded in observation, the absence of wildlife near the academy, the thick, unnatural silence that hung in the trees, the strange black smoke that occasionally rose from behind the building without explanation. Despite all these disappearances and uneasy signs, no formal investigation was launched. Local authorities were scarce and often more interested in maintaining order than uncovering uncomfortable truths. The Blackstones remained untouchable behind their wall of piety and public charity. When children vanished, blame was placed on the wilderness. When strangers disappeared, it was written off as the cost of frontier life. But behind the walls of Blackstone Academy, something far more sinister was at work, hidden beneath layers of false righteousness and community trust. The true nature of Blackstone Academy began to emerge only after its fall, when investigators and townsfolk finally breached its heavy doors. What they found inside forever altered their understanding of what had occurred within those walls. For years, the building had been a fortress, guarded by the Blackstone family and bolstered by the illusion of discipline and piety. But beneath its surface was a network of hidden chambers, concealed passageways, and underground rooms that revealed a far more horrifying reality. The structure of the academy itself had been built with secrecy in mind. Behind false walls and beneath floorboards were compartments large enough to hold bodies, chambers used for confinement, and implements designed not for education but for torment. The main hall of the school led to a series of dormitory rooms, classrooms, and a chapel used for daily prayer. To the casual observer, it looked like a strict but functional place of learning. However, once the academy was abandoned, those who returned with torches and tools discovered panels in the walls that swung open with a hidden latch. These revealed staircases descending into darkness, corridors dug into the earth beneath the building's foundation, and rooms without windows, ventilation, or light. Some rooms were lined with iron rings embedded into the stone walls, likely used for chaining victims. Others had dried bloodstains on the floor and grooves worn into the corners, suggesting long periods of confinement and struggle. Perhaps most disturbing was the so-called reflection chamber, a small, octagonal room lined entirely with mirrors, many cracked, some smeared with what appeared to be dried blood or soot. Survivors later said children were forced to sit in this room for hours while being told to look into their own eyes and confess their sins. According to recovered writings, many in Elias Blackstone's own hand, this chamber was meant to strip away ego and burn the rod of rebellion from the soul. Other rooms contained wooden stocks, manacles, and crude implements fashioned from farm tools, repurposed into devices for punishment. The whipping post, located beneath the main floor in what had once been a storage cellar, bore deep notches in the wood, each marked with initials, perhaps a grotesque tally of those punished or broken there. In one room, stacked neatly in wooden crates, investigators found dozens of personal effects, shoes, letters, trinkets, even children's toys. Some items had names carved into them, others were labeled with crude tags. These were the belongings of the vanished, students and travelers who had never been seen again. One crate contained only spectacles, each pair bent or broken, each set a silent testimony to the person it had once belonged to. Another crate held locks of hair tied with ribbons. No explanation was offered in the writings found nearby, only a journal entry from Temperance Blackstone that read, "The Lord sees the soul best through sacrifice and remembrance." Evidence of torture was not limited to implements and rooms. A wall near the back of the basement had been bricked over in a manner inconsistent with the original structure. When torn down, it revealed a shallow mass grave, skeletal remains tangled together, many of them small, some showing signs of broken bones and blunt force trauma. Forensic study was rudimentary at the time, but the implication was clear. These were not deaths by illness or natural cause. These were hidden bodies, deliberately interred to hide crimes. Scattered among them were rosary beads, cloth remnants of school uniforms, and rusted chains still clamped around some wrists and ankles. A second, narrower tunnel led from the basement into the woods behind the academy. It was only discovered after a portion of the earth caved in, revealing the passage. This was believed to be an escape route, or perhaps a way for the family to dispose of remains without detection. Along its walls were more iron hooks, some with dried fibers still clinging to them. The tunnel opened near a thicket where local hunters often avoided setting traps. They spoke of the area being too quiet, unnaturally so, with animals refusing to go near it. There were no birdsongs, no small game, just silence and the heavy weight of something unspoken. Diaries, letters, and lesson plans, recovered from Elias and Temperance's rooms hinted at a deeper philosophy behind the abuse. They believed they were cleansing corruption, rooting out sin through pain, and that some souls could only be redeemed through trial and transformation. Their methods were codified like doctrine, with punishments assigned based on perceived sins. Pride warranted isolation, sloth earned forced labor, and defiance brought physical mutilation. Each room in the underground network had a purpose, each act of cruelty rationalized as spiritual medicine. In their eyes, the school was not a place of learning, but a crucible for salvation, no matter how much blood it required. The Blackstone family did not view their actions as criminal or even immoral. To them, everything they did was justified by a rigid and fanatical interpretation of Scripture, twisted and weaponized to support their own desires for control, punishment, and dominance. Elias Blackstone saw himself as a prophet more than a teacher. He preached that God had chosen him to purify the world, beginning with the wayward youth of the Illinois Territory. To outsiders, his sermons were passionate and authoritative. To those inside the academy, they were terrifying declarations of divine judgment, often followed by punishments framed as acts of spiritual intervention. Children were told that pain was the only path to purity and that disobedience opened the gates to eternal damnation. This theology, crafted by Elias and reinforced by his family, became the foundation of the horror that unfolded inside the academy. Elias's religious views were not aligned with any mainstream denomination. While he quoted the Bible constantly, he cherry-picked verses and combined them with his own writings, which he claimed were divine revelations. His private journals were filled with interpretations of Scripture that twisted the messages of love, mercy, and redemption into mandates for violence, control, and obedience. One passage from his writings read, "The rod is not for correction, but for salvation. He who suffers in flesh shall rejoice in spirit. The defiled must be broken before they are whole." This line of thinking justified the use of whippings, isolation, starvation, and psychological torment as necessary tools of spiritual cleansing. Temperance Blackstone, far from being a passive accomplice, was the primary enforcer of this religious structure. She saw herself as the spiritual mother to the children and referred to them as her lambs. In her journals, she wrote of casting out demons from disobedient students by forcing them into days of silent prayer, accompanied by food and water deprivation. She led nightly rituals where children were made to kneel in prayer for hours, repeating passages from Scripture while others were punished nearby, forcing them to witness pain as a form of moral instruction. Temperance believed suffering bonded the soul to God and that her role was to ensure no child left the academy untouched by divine correction. The children, many of them too young to understand the difference between religion and indoctrination, were manipulated into believing that their abuse was part of a holy journey. They were told their parents had failed them spiritually and that the academy was their only chance at salvation. Any questioning of the Blackstones' teachings was labeled as demonic influence. Peer pressure and fear kept most silent. Children were encouraged to inform on each other for sins as small as talking during chores or failing to memorize Scripture. These confessions were rewarded, while those accused were punished, often in view of the others, to reinforce the lesson. The Blackstone children themselves were both enforcers and victims. Raised in this belief system, they had been taught from birth that their family was chosen by God to bring light through discipline. Nathaniel, the eldest son, often led prayer sessions and recited Elias's Book of Corrective Light, a text filled with rules and punishments that mimicked biblical language but bore little resemblance to actual doctrine. He was known to deliver punishments with eerie calm, quoting verses as he tied children to posts or locked them in isolation chambers. His siblings, Miriam, Ezekiel, and Ruth, played similar roles, acting as supervisors, scribes, and disciplinarians. Their faith was not questioned, at least not publicly. Behind the scenes, however, there were rumors that Ruth had once tried to run away and was confined for weeks before re-emerging, quieter, and more obedient than before. This strict religious environment was enforced not only through punishment but through ritual. Every Friday, a ceremony known as the Reckoning was held. During this event, children were brought before the family to confess their sins and accept correction. The room was lit only by candles, and hymns were chanted as each child knelt and waited for their name to be called. Some were whipped. Others were made to kneel for hours or wear signs that read, "Prideful, Liar," or "Sloth." These rituals were framed as sacred, designed to burn out the rod of Satan and prepare the soul for divine grace. The surrounding community saw only the surface of this religiosity. Elias delivered fiery sermons in town, often condemning the moral decline of society and urging parents to take stricter measures to raise obedient children. Many agreed with him, mistaking his madness for conviction. His warnings about sin and discipline played well in a culture already steeped in puritanical values. Because his rhetoric echoed the fire and brimstone preachers of the day, few questioned the extremity of his views. Even those who found his tone harsh assumed his academy was simply strict, not sadistic. Religion became both the shield and the sword for the Blackstones, allowing them to operate a house of horrors under the guise of spiritual righteousness. For years, the Blackstone family operated their academy without interference, protected by the illusion of religious purpose and community goodwill. But as more children went missing and unsettling stories began to emerge, a quiet unrest took hold among those living near the property. The Blackstones had always been respected, even admired, for their discipline and charity. Yet over time, admiration turned to unease. Small remarks were made in whispers, and questions began to linger without satisfying answers. Parents whose children had attended the school but never returned started writing letters to one another, trying to piece together what had happened. These efforts were scattered and often met with silence or deflection from the Blackstones. Still, the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. It was a series of small events that finally began to unravel the Blackstone family's hold on the community. A girl named Hannah Greaves, who had once been enrolled at the academy and dismissed for unrepentant blasphemy, came forward with disturbing claims. Now living with an aunt in a nearby town, Hannah recounted stories of being locked in closets for days, beaten during prayer sessions, and forced to watch as others were punished for minor infractions. She bore scars on her back and wrists, and though many still doubted her at first, she had something no one could ignore, a journal she had kept in secret, with dates, names, and details of punishments. It listed children who had vanished and included entries about the sounds from beneath the floor at night, screams, scratching, and weeping that were quickly silenced. Hannah's testimony stirred a small group of townspeople into action. Among them was Reverend Martin Hale, a local preacher who had long admired Elias Blackstone but had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his private theology. Hale began organizing meetings at his chapel, inviting others who had questions or doubts about the academy. He collected stories from grieving parents, former workers, and even drifters who had passed through the area and noted the strange stillness around the property. These accounts, once fragmented and unconnected, began to form a coherent picture of sustained abuse, secrecy, and deliberate isolation. Even with growing concern, few were willing to confront the Blackstones directly. The family had built a reputation for being devout and charitable, and to accuse them of wrongdoing without undeniable proof risked social and even legal backlash. Elias had powerful allies, merchants, town leaders, and ministers who admired his strict moral stance. Still, Reverend Hale persisted. He gathered every letter, every statement, and eventually took his concerns to the territorial authorities. Initially, they hesitated. The law in 1812 Illinois was limited, enforcement scattered, and jurisdiction unclear. But the weight of testimony, particularly from Hannah and others who had once lived at the academy, eventually forced their hand. A small group of lawmen, accompanied by Hale and several townspeople, approached the academy under the pretense of conducting a health inspection. Elias greeted them with his usual stoic calm, but something in his demeanor changed when they demanded access to the entire property. He argued, resisted, invoked the sanctity of his mission and accused them of persecuting righteousness. By then, the gathered crowd outside the academy had grown. Parents, townspeople, and former students stood watching, silent but firm. The front doors, long a symbol of the academy's impenetrability, were pushed open, and for the first time, the community crossed the threshold not as guests, but as investigators. What they found inside shook them to their core. The stench of rot, the bloodstains hidden beneath rugs, the chains, the hidden rooms, and the personal belongings of missing children told a story too terrible to dismiss. Elias was arrested on the spot, along with Temperance and their children. The family did not speak during their apprehension. They offered no denial, no resistance, only silent stares, as if convinced that their divine mission had been betrayed by a sinful world. The crowd stood in stunned silence, watching the fall of a family they had once revered. Word spread quickly. Over the next several weeks, the academy was searched from top to bottom. Items were catalogued, writings were examined, and bodies were uncovered. The evidence overwhelmed any remaining doubt. Neighbors who had once defended the Blackstones now looked back in horror, questioning how they had missed the signs. Many remembered moments they had ignored, cries in the night, strange behavior from the Blackstone children, visitors who never returned, but had dismissed them as the quirks of a strict household. Now, all of it took on a new meaning. Some within the town believed they had been under a spell, not of magic, but of fear and misplaced faith. Elias had spoken with such conviction, used scripture so fluently, and maintained such composure that even skeptics hesitated to challenge him. He had built a wall not just of brick and wood, but of belief, and behind it, atrocities had taken root. The community was left to wrestle not only with the horror of what had been done, but with their own failure to see it sooner. After the fall of the Blackstone family and the exposure of the horrors within their so-called academy, the surrounding region was left in a state of stunned silence. What had once been spoken of as a proud example of discipline and education was now the site of mass graves, ritual abuse, and unspeakable cruelty. News of the discovery spread beyond Illinois territory, reaching as far as frontier papers in St. Louis, Cincinnati, and even the eastern seaboard. Writers, ministers, and politicians seized on the story, some using it as a warning against unchecked authority, while others dismissed it as exaggerated frontier hysteria. But for those who had lived near the Blackstones or sent their children to the academy, there was no debate. The truth had been unearthed, and its weight would linger for generations. In the immediate aftermath, Blackstone Academy was abandoned, its doors left open to the elements. The building quickly fell into decay, but few dared to approach it. Some families demanded it be torn down, but others argued that it should remain standing as a warning. Eventually, storms and neglect did what the community could not, and the academy collapsed into rubble. Still, the land remained untouched. Farmers avoided it, children were warned not to go near it, and travelers spoke of a feeling of dread when passing its borders. The woods behind the ruins grew thick and twisted, untouched by axes or plows. Locals began to call the area the Hollow, and stories about it took on a life of their own. Legends began to form, shaped by a mixture of memory, fear, and folklore. Some claimed to hear voices crying from the ruins at night. Others swore that lights flickered in the woods even when no one lived nearby. Hunters and trappers began avoiding the area entirely, saying the land itself had turned sour. The Blackstones became figures of myth, part history, part ghost story. Children were warned that if they disobeyed, Elias Blackstone would come for them in the dark. Campfire tales spoke of Temperance appearing in the woods, her hands soaked in blood, offering to cleanse those who had sinned. The atrocities of the academy were transformed into cautionary tales, repeated with shivers and nervous glances. At the same time, the case sparked changes in how institutions were viewed across the region. Community leaders began to question the lack of oversight at religious and private schools. New settlements emerging in the following decades passed laws requiring more transparency and regular checks on facilities that housed children. Clergymen were scrutinized more carefully, and claims of spiritual authority no longer guaranteed blind trust. Though these changes came slowly and inconsistently, the memory of the Blackstones lingered like a shadow over the development of such policies. Writers, both factual and fictional, drew inspiration from the case for years. In the mid-19th century, serialized newspaper accounts retold the Blackstone story with dramatic flair, sometimes embellishing it with demonic elements or tying it to other unsolved disappearances across the frontier. Novels, plays, and penny dreadfuls began to appear, painting Elias as a cult leader, Temperance as a witch, and the Academy as a literal portal to hell. These stories exaggerated certain facts but kept the core horror intact. They fed the public's fascination with moral failure, hidden evil, and the dangers of unchecked power. Long after the actual facts were buried in yellowed court transcripts and fading memories, the story lived on in print, performance, and rumor. Even in the 20th century, the story found new life. Historians and folklorists attempted to separate fact from fiction, but the line had already blurred beyond recovery. Paranormal investigators visited the ruins, claiming to detect spiritual energy or ghostly presences. Documentarians tried to reconstruct the layout of the Academy, using old maps and survivor accounts. A few descendants of the Blackstone children, those who had managed to escape or had been spared the worst, spoke out in their old age, offering fragmented recollections of chance, punishments, and the ever-present fear. Their testimonies brought the story back into public discussion, reframing it not just as a tale of evil, but as a warning about how communities can be manipulated into complicity. The legacy of the Blackstone family and their academy did not simply fade into the past. It became part of the cultural fabric of Illinois folklore and, by extension, a symbol of how evil can hide behind righteousness. For decades, families passing down stories of the frontier would include the tale of the school where children were broken in the name of salvation. Some believed the ground was cursed, others believed it had been sanctified through the suffering of the innocent. In either case, the memory of what had happened was never entirely erased. B5